They say every mother would do anything for her child. I would too. But when the police dragged me out of the burning house and asked where he was, all I could do was scream, "In the bedroom!" The silence that followed condemned me more than the fire. Before the smell of smoke, our house smelled of baby powder and warm milk. It was a scent that seeped into the sheets, the curtains, and even my clothes. A constant perfume that reminded me that I was no longer just a woman. I was someone's entire world. Our apartment was small, with thin walls and a permanent creak in the floorboards near the kitchen, but it was our sanctuary. In the small kitchen window, I kept a potted fern. That week, it began to dry out, its leaves turning brown and brittle no matter how much I watered it. It was a bad omen I ignored, the first small patch of gray in our colorful world. Life was a silent struggle, a constant math of bills and coins. I worked double shifts at a diner, the smell of grease and cheap coffee in my hair when I got home. My feet ached, my back burned, but it all disappeared the moment I opened the door and saw Leo's toothless smile in his playpen. He was the reason and the reward. His father's absence was a ghost that haunted the corners of the apartment. The unanswered calls, the promises of a deposit that never arrived. Each one was a small cut, a reminder of my loneliness on this journey. Sometimes at night, after Leo fell asleep, I would sit in the darkness of the living room and let the weight of it all consume me. Fear was a constant companion, the fear of not being enough, of failing, of not being able to give him the life he deserved. But there were moments of pure magic. Friday nights were our extravagance, cheap pizza eaten on the living room floor and an old animated movie on TV. I'd hold him in my arms, feeling his warm, soft breath on my neck, and the world outside with its bills and its fears simply ceased to exist. That last night, the night before the fire, we did just that. I remember how he laughed, a guttural, infectious laugh, when the cartoon coyote fell off a cliff for the 10th time. His little fingers clung to my shirt as he fell asleep in my lap. I carried him to his crib, tucked him under the blue blanket with little rockets on it, and kissed his forehead. His scent was my favorite smell in the world. If I'd known that was our last night of peace, I would have treasured every second. I would have memorized every detail of his serene face, every soft breath. I would have stayed there, watching over his sleep until the sun rose. The sleep of a working mother isn't rest. It's collapse. But that night, something pulled me out of the abyss. It wasn't a sound, but a smell. A chemical, oily smell, completely out of place in our small apartment. My eyes opened in the darkness, and the smell grew stronger, unmistakable. Gasoline. My first thought was confusion. Maybe a car leaking on the street, the smell wafting through the open kitchen window. But it was too strong, too present. I sat up in bed, my heart beginning to pound anxiously against my ribs. Then I saw it. A thin line of oily black smoke billowing from beneath my door. Panic hit me like a brick wall. Cold, absolute, and paralyzing. Leo. I leaped from the bed, running for the door. The smoke was already thicker in the hallway, stinging my eyes and scratching my throat. The apartment, my sanctuary, was turning into a trap. Leo's bedroom door was at the end of the short hallway. It seemed a mile away. I screamed his name, but my voice was swallowed by the growing crackling sound, a hungry, living sound. "Leo!" I screamed again, the hot, toxic air filling my lungs. When I reached his door, the heat was intense. I placed my hand on the metal doorknob, and a cry of pain escaped my lips. It was red hot. I yanked my hand back, my skin already blistering. The fire was on the other side. It was on his wall, in his room. Desperate, I threw my body against the door. Once, twice, 3 times. It didn't budge. It was locked or blocked. I screamed, a mixture of rage and pure terror, pounding the wood with my fists. The smoke was a monster now, blinding and suffocating. I couldn't breathe, couldn't see. The world was reduced to heat, the pain in my hand and that wooden door separating me from my son. The sound of the fire was a roar now. I remember falling to my knees, coughing, the poison filling my body. My last coherent thought, before the world began to darken, was his bedroom window. I always locked it. Every night, without fail, I checked the lock. The door was blocked. The window should have been locked. Nothing made sense. The smell of gasoline, the door that wouldn't open, these weren't the details of an accident. They were the details of a contrived nightmare. The next thing I remember was the cold, biting night air on my face and the sound of sirens screaming in my ear. Someone was dragging me across the grass. My lungs burned with every breath, expelling black smoke. "My son!" I managed to scream, my throat raw. "He's in there, in the bedroom!" A firefighter, his face smeared with soot, held me tight. "We can't go in yet, ma'am. The roof is about to collapse." His words didn't register. The only reality was my house, now a hellish maw of orange flames and black smoke, spewing embers against the night sky. And my son was inside. A police officer wrapped me in a rough blanket, the fabric scratching my skin, and began asking me questions. "What's your name? How old is your son?" I tried to answer, but my mind was a haze of panic. That's when the stares started. My neighbors, people I'd said a hurried good morning to on my way to work, were clustered on the sidewalk. Their faces, illuminated by the rotating, flashing lights of police cars, held no compassion. It was a sickening mix of morbid curiosity and something darker, something that was beginning to form: judgment. I wasn't crying hysterically. Shock had frozen my tears, leaving my face a mask of soot and confusion. And in the unwritten manual of tragedy, a mother who doesn't cry is a guilty mother. I heard whispers, phrases that floated in the smoke like poisonous ash. Where was she? Poor little child. She always looked so exhausted. Each word was a nail in my coffin. The officer's questions grew harsher. Why did you leave without him? How did the fire start? Before reaching the police station, there was a mandatory stop at the emergency room. While a nurse treated the blisters on my hand, a police officer photographed the injuries. No one asked if the pain in my burned hand was proof that I'd tried to open that door. They simply noted in the report that I appeared cold and emotionless. The moment the dehumanization began was crystal clear. A firefighter emerged from the burning house, shaking his head. The silence that followed was louder than any siren. It was in that silence that the officer told me to put my hands behind my back. The cold click of the handcuffs on my wrist was the sound that sealed my fate. They placed me in the back of the car. Through the glass, I watched my house collapse in on itself, taking my son, my life, and my innocence with it. On that sidewalk, I was tried and convicted before I was even formally charged with any crime. The courtroom was a theater of browns and dark wood, a solemn place designed to crush the spirit. My public defender, Mr. Harris, was a middle-aged man with a wrinkled suit and a perpetually weary look in his eyes. He spoke to me in monosyllables, his eyes always focused on a stack of papers from another case. He saw me not as a person, but as a number on a long list of inevitable losses. "The prosecution has a strong case," he told me in one of our brief meetings, in a windowless room that smelled of dust and despair. "They have inconsistent testimony. There are no witnesses. The best option is a plea bargain. 25 years. With good behavior, you'll be out in 15. 15 years for a crime I didn't commit." The offer left me breathless. I rejected it. If the truth was the only thing I had left, I would cling to it, even if I drowned. The prosecutor, on the other hand, was a rising star, young, charismatic, with an impeccable suit and a ruthless confidence. He turned me into a monster with frightening ease. For the jury, he painted the portrait of a single mother, oppressed and resentful. My poverty became a motive, my 2 jobs evidence of neglect, my exhaustion a symptom of a mind on the verge of collapse. "She wanted to be free of the burden," he said in his opening statement, his voice resonating in the silence of the room. She wanted her freedom back, and on that tragic night, she took it at the cost of her own son's life. Each word was a knife, twisting the purest love I had ever known into something ugly and unrecognizable. The story he told was so compelling that for a few terrifying moments, even I doubted myself. When it was my turn to testify, I was a bundle of nerves. I tried to tell the truth, talk about the locked window, the smell of gasoline, the door that wouldn't open. But under the prosecutor's relentless questioning, my traumatized memories sounded like flimsy excuses. So, you're telling us that a mysterious figure broke into your home, doused it with gasoline, kidnapped your son without a trace, and then set it on fire, all without you hearing a thing? He made the truth sound like the most ridiculous fiction. I looked at the jury, ordinary faces, people who could have been my neighbors. They looked at me with a mixture of pity and revulsion. They had already heard the story they wanted to believe. The verdict was just a formality. When the jury foreman stood and uttered the word guilty, the sound came not as a shock, but as the final echo of a sentence that had been handed down on that sidewalk the night of the fire. The judge's gavel fell, and the world I knew disappeared forever. The transport to Oakwood State Prison for women was a silent journey to hell. We were chained together in a windowless van, the air heavy with the smell of sweat and unspoken fear. No one spoke. The only sound was the rattle of chains and the hum of the engine driving us further away from the light. When the barbed wire gates closed behind us with a metallic clang, a piece of me died. This was real. The reception was a systematic process of soul dismantling. We were lined up in a corridor, painted a sickly green, and ordered to remove everything. My clothes, the last relics of my former life, were thrown into a plastic bag. I stood naked, shivering under the fluorescent lights and the indifferent eyes of the guards. I was searched, poked, and sprayed with a cold, foul-smelling disinfectant. Then they took my name. "From now on, you are inmate 734, said a guard with a face that seemed carved from stone. Memorize it. Answer to it. That's who you are now. The uniform they gave me was a faded orange, rough against my skin, and smelled of bleach and the countless anonymous bodies that had worn it before me. It was the uniform of a monster. I pulled on my heavy boots and followed the line, each step echoing the loss of my identity. I was led through a series of iron gates that opened and closed with terrible finality until we reached my cell block. The noise was a cacophony of screams, loud conversations, and the constant echo of metal against concrete. The smell was even worse here, a suffocating mix of undercooked food, sewage, and human despair. My cell was a 2-by-3-meter concrete box. It had a metal bunk, a small sink combined with a stainless steel toilet, and nothing else. The woman on the bottom bunk stared at me with empty eyes. It was the same scarred woman I would see every day for years to come. "The rule is simple," she said, her voice emotionless. "Half the cell is yours, half is mine. Don't cross the line. Don't talk to me unless I talk to you. And don't cry at night. No one wants to hear." She turned to the wall, ending the conversation. I stood there, clutching my thin mattress and a roll of toilet paper. And then I heard the sound that would become the soundtrack of my new life. The sound of a heavy steel cell door sliding and slamming, followed by the click of the lock. A sound of absolute finality. I was no longer in shock. I was no longer confused. In that moment, in that concrete box, I understood. I had entered my tomb. The first few months were a lesson in invisibility. I learned that in prison, personal space is both a non-existent luxury and the most dangerous thing to invade. The air was charged with constant tension, a static electricity of unresolved trauma and pent-up aggression, ready to explode at the slightest pretext. A bump in the cafeteria line, a glance that lingered a second too long, a word spoken in the wrong tone. I learned to walk with my eyes fixed on the ground, to make my body appear smaller, to blend in with the peeling green walls. Silence was my armor. My cellmate, whose name I learned was Ramona, rarely spoke, but her actions were a survival manual. I watched her fold her clothes into a perfect square, clean her half of the cell with silent fury, and eat her meals with methodical speed, her eyes ever alert. She taught me, Without ever saying a word, the first law of that place: do not show weakness. Ever. There was an invisible hierarchy, but it was as rigid as the steel bars. The prison families weren't about affection, they were about power. The leaders, women hardened by years in the system, controlled the trade in goods: extra coffee, smuggled cigarettes, soap that didn't smell of disinfectant. They were the ones who settled disputes, meted out punishments, and maintained brutal order. I stayed as far away from them as possible. In the yard, during the only hour of fresh air of the day, I would find a corner and stand there, feeling the weak sun on my skin as I watched the power dynamics unfold like a dangerous ballet. I saw a woman beaten for owing a package of instant noodles. I saw friendships unravel over gossip. I learned that loyalty was a rare and dangerous currency, and I had nothing to buy anyone's. Fear was a constant taste in my mouth. My invisibility was broken one day in the cafeteria line. Agnes, a lifer whose crime everyone knew and respected, blocked my path. "I heard you're the baby killer," she said, her voice low and full of venom, so only the surrounding women could hear. "Here, we despise your kind more than the guards." I didn't respond, just grabbed my tray and left, but the label had officially been affixed. The confrontation was silent, but the declaration of war had been made. That night, for the first time, the fear wasn't just of my memories. The worst fear was the fear of the night. When the lights went out, the darkness brought no rest. I heard the muffled cries in the pillows, the whispers, the nightmares manifesting in stifled screams. And in the silence between these sounds, my own memories assaulted me. Leo's face, the smell of smoke, the word guilty echoing endlessly. I learned to cry inside, swallowing the sobs until they became a physical pain in my chest. After months of exemplary behavior, I was assigned to work in the laundry. It was considered one of the best jobs. The hot steam from the industrial machines was a welcome escape from the constant chill of the cells, and the deafening noise offered a kind of privacy. The laundry was the beating, sweaty heart of the prison. It was there that stories circulated, along with the dirty sheets and stained uniforms. The smell was an overpowering mix of bleach, sweat, and the metallic odor of steam. But for me, it was the smell of oblivion. For 8 hours a day, I was just a pair of hands, folding, stacking, pushing carts. The repetitive rhythm was a forced meditation that kept my memories at bay. The work was hard and monotonous. My arms ached, my back felt permanently stiff, and the skin on my hands was red and cracked from the chemicals. But there was a strange satisfaction in seeing the piles of clean, folded sheets growing beside me. It was the only thing in my life I could put in order. The laundry room was run by a group of older women, the lifers. It was there that I learned the nuances of prison communication. A nod that meant careful, a look that said be quiet, a small extra bar of soap left on top of my pile that was a rare sign of approval. It was in the laundry room that the real drama unfolded, muffled by the hum of the machines. I saw messages being passed inside folded pillowcases. I saw debts being collected silently behind a laundry cart. I heard fragments of confessions whispered over the noise, stories of love, betrayal, and regret. These were women who had been mothers, daughters, wives, and were now just numbers washing the dirt of others. It was there that I saw Agnes again after our confrontation. She was working the press, her muscular arms moving with practiced efficiency. Our eyes met over a mountain of orange uniforms. There was no longer hatred in her eyes, only a deep weariness, the weariness of a soul carrying its own burden. In that moment, amid the steam and noise, I didn't see her as my accuser. I saw her as myself, a broken woman, trapped in a cycle of punishment and loss, trying to find a way to simply survive until the next day. If the laundry room was the body of the prison, the library was its secret, dusty soul. It was a small room, crammed with paperbacks with torn covers and yellowed pages. Most inmates came here to pick up cheap novels or simply enjoy the silence. But for a small group, it was a sanctuary. And at the center of this sanctuary stood Eleanor. She didn't seem to belong there. There was a dignity about her, an intellectual stillness that contrasted with the brutality around us. Even in her orange uniform, she looked like she was wearing tweed. Her gray hair was always pulled back in a neat bun, and her eyes, behind cheap reading glasses, were sharp and incredibly lively. Rumor had it she had been a history professor at a university, sentenced to life imprisonment for a crime of passion no one dared ask about. I started going to the library to escape. The silence was a balm. I would pick up books at random and pretend to read, just so I could sit at one of the metal tables and not be disturbed. Eleanor never spoke to me, but I felt her eyes on me from time to time. She didn't look with judgment, but with an analytical curiosity, as if I were a historical problem she was trying to solve. The courage to speak to her took weeks to build, fueled by a growing hopelessness. The final spark, however, came in the form of a piece of paper. The arrival of my ex-partner Mark's letter was the catalyst. I read those few cowardly sentences over and over again. "I'm sorry for everything. I hope you find peace." They weren't the words of a man grieving. They were the words of a man absolving himself. The absence of Leo's name, the absence of pain. It was the letter of a fugitive. With the letter in hand, anger finally overcame fear. I walked to the library and approached Eleanor's desk. "Excuse me," I whispered, my voice trembling. She looked up from a book, and then the words simply came out, a torrent of pain and confusion. I talked about the window, the gasoline, and finally, I showed her the letter. She read it once, then a second time. "This is not a letter of condolence," she said finally. "It is a veiled confession of abandonment." That day, Eleanor didn't offer me sympathy. She offered me a curriculum. She taught me to use the library itself, not as an escape, but as an arsenal. "Anger is a poison," she said. "Hope is a weapon, but a useless weapon if you don't know how to use it. The system only understands its own language, facts, procedures, petitions." She gave me more than a plan. She gave me a purpose beyond survival. Our investigation began in the library, but the war was fought on my cell wall. Using pieces of chalk and a smuggled eyeliner, we began mapping out the case. "We need the official fire department report," Eleanor would say. "We need the transcripts, the photos, everything." Our Freedom of Information Act requests were denied, returned, lost in the bureaucracy. "They're counting on you to exhaust yourself," Eleanor would explain. "We won't exhaust ourselves." And we didn't. We rewrote the requests, citing statutes and precedents Eleanor found in old law books. Months passed. And then one day, a small miracle. A manila envelope arrived. Inside, a copy of the arson expert's report. We sat on the cell floor, the paper spread out between us. Most of it was technical jargon, but Eleanor found it. A small footnote on page 17. "Traces of accelerant, consistent with high-octane gasoline, detected near the bedroom's rear window." The official report attributed it to a leak from a non-existent lawnmower. But the real revelation was in another short note at the bottom of the page. The expert wrote, "Pry marks on the bedroom window latch, signs consistent with forced opening from the outside." I read the sentence 3 times. My lungs emptied. I always locked it. Every night, someone had opened it from the outside. That small detail changed everything. It was no longer just my word against the world's. Now we had facts, facts that had been ignored. We pinned the copy of that page to our wall. It became the center of our map. From that discovery, our work intensified. We wrote letters to innocence organizations, to law students, to anyone who would listen. Most didn't respond. But Eleanor taught me about the nature of hope. "Hope isn't optimism," she said, looking at our growing map. "It's the certainty that what you're doing has meaning, regardless of the outcome." And what we were doing did have meaning. We were fighting for the truth. And in that dark cell, that was the only light we had. Almost a year had passed since the discovery in the arson report. A year of unanswered letters, of bureaucratic silence, of fading hope. The wall of my cell was a testament to our struggle, but it was beginning to feel like a memorial to a lost cause. And then, on a gray Tuesday, my number was called for an unexpected visit. My heart froze. I was escorted to the visiting room and sat on the cold metal chair. On the other side of the scratched glass, a middle-aged woman with a kind face appeared. She introduced herself as Martha, a social worker. "I investigate cold cases of illegal adoptions," she began. "I found a file that caught my attention. A boy, privately and hastily placed for adoption. The dates matched your case." Each word was a small hammer blow to the ice that encased my heart. I could barely breathe. "Don't you dare hope." Hope was the longest, most painful fall of all. "I know this will be a shock," Martha said, her eyes fixed on mine. Then she opened a folder and took out a photograph. She pressed it against the glass. Time stood still. There, in that colorful image, was the face of a boy of about 7. Messy brown hair, a missing front tooth, and a shy smile that was so familiar it hurt. And the eyes. They were my father's eyes. They were my eyes. They were Leo's eyes. A sound escaped my throat. An animal noise, halfway between a sob and a scream. My hands flew to the glass, my fingers spreading over the image. He was alive. The sentence exploded in my mind with the force of a supernova. Alive. The joy was so overwhelming that for a second nothing else mattered. He was breathing, smiling, living somewhere in this world. But then, like a shadow chasing the light, another realization came, cold and terrible. If Leo was alive, then the never-found body wasn't a mystery. It was proof of a kidnapping. If he was kidnapped, the fire was staged. The smell of gasoline, the locked door, the broken window. These were the components of a trap. And there was only one person who could have set it. The joy turned to ice in my veins. I wasn't a grieving mother. I was the victim of a monstrous conspiracy. And the search for my innocence had just become a hunt for the man who stole my son. The discovery that Leo was alive transformed my lawyer, Sarah, from an idealistic defender into a force of nature. With proof of Michael's existence, Leo's new name, and Martha's testimony, she secured what had previously been impossible: a court order to reopen the case. Locating Mark was surprisingly easy. He wasn't a criminal mastermind, just a cowardly man living a mediocre life in another state. His arrest was a minor note in the newspaper, but his confession was a major earthquake. Thanks to a court order Sarah managed to extract from a sympathetic judge, they set up an old TV in an administrative office so I could watch the recording. Eleanor stood beside me, her presence a silent rock. On the screen I saw him, older, heavier, his face puffy. At first, he was all arrogance, but then they started presenting the evidence. The bank statement, the testimony of the illegal adoption broker, Michael's photo. With each new piece of evidence, his armor crumbled. The final blow came when the detective read the letter I'd written to my son. Hearing those words, something inside him finally broke. The confession came tumbling out. He blamed the debts, the pressure, me. He told everything, how he'd drugged my coffee, but maybe the dose was too low or the smell of gasoline was strong enough to shake me from my stupor. He told how he'd pulled Leo out through the broken window and pushed the heavy dresser against the door from the inside. "I just needed time," he sobbed. "I needed the fire to start before you could get there." He'd handed him over to a stranger in a parking lot for $40,000. Watching it didn't bring me the satisfaction I'd hoped for. There was no triumph, only a deep, sad emptiness. I was staring at the ruin of a man. Victory tasted like ashes. When the tape ended, I was silent for a long time. Eleanor placed her hand on my shoulder. "It's over," she said softly. And it was. The news of my exoneration spread through the prison like wildfire. That night, for the first time in almost 4 years, there were no screams in my cell block. There was a respectful silence. My war was over. The day of my release arrived not with fanfare, but with the bureaucratic click of a lock. A guard opened my cell and said, "734, get your things, you're out." My things consisted of a notebook, Michael's faded photo, and Eleanor's letters. I dressed in the civilian clothes they'd given me, jeans and a t-shirt that looked like an alien suit. The walk down the main hallway was the longest of my life. The women stopped to watch. I saw Agnes in the laundry room. She met my gaze, and for the first time, I saw something like regret on her face. I passed the library, and Eleanor stood at the door. She handed me a paperback. "Hope is the thing with feathers," she whispered, quoting the cover. We embraced, a quick, awkward embrace that held the weight of years of struggle. "Live for both of us," she said. As the last steel door rolled aside, the sunlight hit me with a physical force. I staggered back, dazed. The air, it smelled. The smell of wet grass, of car exhaust, of freedom. It was so different from the recycled prison air that it made me dizzy. The world seemed incredibly loud and fast. Sarah and Martha were there, waiting. Their smiles were the only familiar thing in this strange universe. I got in the car, and as we drove away, I glanced back at the oppressive gray mass of the penitentiary. In one of the small, barred windows on the top floor, I saw a silhouette. Eleanor. She was there, watching. We didn't wave. We didn't need to. Freedom wasn't the burst of joy I'd imagined. It was terrifying. Every choice was a weight. I was free of the steel bars, but the bars in my mind were still firmly in place. The journey to meet Michael was the most terrifying of my life. Guided by Martha and therapists, we began with letters. My first letter took 3 days to write. In the end, I wrote the simplest truth. "Dear Michael, my name is Anna. I am your biological mother. There was a time when I thought I would never see you again, but there has never been a day when I didn't love you." The wait for a reply was torture. When it finally arrived, it was a small card with a drawing of a rocket, like the ones on his old blanket, and a single sentence, "I want to meet you too." I cried for an hour. Then came the phone calls. Hearing his voice for the first time was surreal. It was the voice of a stranger. Our conversations were awkward. We talked about safe things, school, friends, video games. I never mentioned prison. He never mentioned the fire. His adoptive parents, Clara and Tom, were incredibly brave. They too were victims in Mark's story, and instead of resentment, they offered me grace. They knew their son needed to know his truth. The first meeting was in a park. When I saw him running across the grass, my heart stopped and started again. He was real. The first hour was almost unbearably strange. But then, he tripped and fell. I ran to him instinctively. I knelt beside him, brushing the dirt from his knee. "It's okay," I said, my voice shaking. "It's just a scratch." He looked at me, his big brown eyes filled with tears and surprise. And then it happened. "Thank you, Mom," he whispered. The word hung in the air between us, fragile and powerful. It was a slip, an instinct, but it changed everything. In that moment, the ice that had formed around my heart for years finally began to melt. We weren't healed, not even close. But the bridge between us now had its first and most important plank in place. Today, my life is silent. And for the first time, the silence isn't scary. I live in a small apartment with a window overlooking a park. I've found purpose in the most unlikely place. I work as a research assistant for the same innocence organization that helped me. I spend my days reading transcripts, searching for those same inconsistencies that can mean the difference between a life and a grave. It's meticulous work, but every little file I help assemble is a letter I send to Eleanor. My greatest refuge, however, is the community garden at the end of my street. I've discovered there's something profoundly healing about burying my hands in the earth. Pulling weeds is like uprooting the lies I've been told about myself. Planting a new seed is an act of faith in the future. Caring for something and watching it grow fills a void in me that I thought would be permanent. The garden has taught me the patience of healing. Some plants don't survive, some scars never completely fade. But with each new flower that blooms, I'm reminded that life is stubbornly resilient. My relationship with Michael is like one of those delicate plants. It requires care and patience. We see each other on weekends. Sometimes he calls me Anna. Sometimes he calls me Mom. I accept both. We're building something new, something not defined by the past, but informed by it. He has 2 families who love him, and we're slowly learning to be one big, messy landscape. Sometimes he comes to help me in the garden. We don't talk much, we just dig, plant, and water side by side. One day, while we were planting tomatoes, he looked at me and said, "It's strange. The fire took everything from you, but now you spend all day helping things grow." I looked at him, my miracle son, with dirt in his hands and sun in his hair, and smiled. "Sometimes," I said, "you have to go through the ashes to find the place where the garden was waiting to be born." And for the first time, I believed it with all my heart. They say every mother would do anything for her child, and when the world fell silent to my pain, I understood. Sometimes, the greatest proof of love is not dying for someone, but surviving for them. In my heart, the guilt imposed on me became the bridge to truth. The garden was not my ending, but my new beginning. And now I ask you, what is hope when the system that should protect you is the same one that condemns you? If my story made you believe in resilience, share it with anyone facing a seemingly impossible battle. I want to hear from you. Are we defined by the injustice we suffer or by how we overcome it? Where is the line between blind justice and a person's truth? In my garden, am I planting seeds or burying my past? Search here for stories that reveal our strength in the darkest places. Subscribe and activate the bell. A flower that rises from the ashes doesn't ask for permission. It comes. Comment, share, subscribe.